Good evening and welcome. As you know, it's our high pleasure to have a Crown Fellow as our guest tonight, Reid Hoffman. And let me start, Reid, by asking you, one of the themes here is on networks and platforms. How did you take LinkedIn and make it more than just a web service, make it into a real platform that can be used on many things?
So one of the things is I actually think we're living in a networked age, and most people say, oh yeah, I understand, I have an iPhone. But actually, in fact, most people don't understand that. So for example, in a networked age, one of the things is, what is your strategy for being found? Because there's millions of other people searching, so it's not just how you search, it's actually how you're found. There's other aspects to that, but when you begin to look at networks as platforms, what networks as platforms means is there's an identity, whether that's a social identity, professional identity, a media identity, other kind of identity. And then there's a set of what is referred to in Silicon Valley as graphs, which is the network connections of some relationship that you have with other people and other entities. That forms a platform because you can build applications on top of it. So for example, LinkedIn is most normally associated with recruiting and job searching. You can do that as applications, but then for example, you can also find out business intelligence or find people to do business with. Or, for example, professional discussion in terms of having business leaders articulate what kinds of things, how they lead companies, how they build companies, what kinds of things that they are doing or they need to have happen in the world. And then that then becomes each of these applications are ways that we navigate life. And the network as a platform helps because it helps people who say, okay, here's my identity. For example, if I'm a Silicon Valley internet product manager, what is the business news that I need to know today? Because that helps me navigate my life. And each of these applications are a different form of navigation, and that's part of how networks form the basis of being a platform for applications.
When Steve Jobs was resistant to the allowing people to build apps on the iOS platform, he finally relented, and that opened up an entire new economy. Do you see it someday, people being able to build things upon the LinkedIn platform?
I think any platform, as it succeeds and matures, gets there. So I think that is very likely going to be the case. I don't know which year it is. I don't know if it's next year or 10 years from now, but we already have APIs by which people do build certain applications through special arrangement with us.
And what about building services for the social good or community good using LinkedIn? How are you facilitating that?
So one of the things that I think is particularly interesting is that I actually think counter Milton Friedman's classic argument, corporations actually do have a very strong moral responsibility. I think Milton Friedman's classic argument, which is the moral responsibility of corporations is return profits to shareholders, and that's it, was based on the notion of the philanthropic dollar being taken either from the customer or from the employee or from the shareholder and then simply given to a nonprofit. But corporations are platforms. There's places where they spend a dollar that has $100 or even more of impact. And so each corporation should do that. So for example, what LinkedIn does is we focus on, for example, how do you help veterans find jobs, because it's one of the things that we're actually very good with. How do you help nonprofits find board members? We're actually about to kick off some stuff on mentorship and how do you have young folks find mentors in order to help them with their careers. Because these are things when we expend resources, we can essentially have a much greater impact than the dollars that we're spending on them. And ideally, of course, it then becomes reinforcing because it doesn't necessarily need to be 100% altruistic, that it's simply a lost dollar. If it actually adds value into the platform, that then creates a virtuous cycle.
But you have a structure in LinkedIn in which you're not truly a full-fledged public corporation because you have A and B stock, things like that. How does a full-fledged public corporation justify doing things that are not directly a return to shareholder value?
Well, everything, part of the whole thing is the whole, what are you building in the future? Whether it's your brand value, whether it's community response, you can actually, when you say, look, over the long term, this will make us a much stronger company. Now, it's easier if you put it in your guidelines from when you go public and say, look.
Did you do that?
We did, right. And it's also easier, of course, when you have dual class control. And most of the companies that you see doing this, not all, but most, actually have that sort of A and B stock structure.
Is there a way we should change the corporate structure in America to make it more easy for corporations to have a social as well as a shareholder mission?
Well, I think it would be a good thing to have essentially, I mean, this is a little bit of what B Corp's doing, which is to say, now it doesn't have to be as aggressive.
Explain B Corp.
So B Corps basically say that a board of directors can legitimately help the company govern based on things that are not purely profitability. And those are associated with a mission that is then publicly stated by the corporation. And I actually think it would be a good thing, but I think you can, like for example, Mackey arguing with Whole Foods and everything else. I think you could do a lot of this in the basis of, look, we just think this is the right way to establish the right relationship with the community and the right brand and the right relationship with the customers. But I also think that it's a good thing to be able to say, and here's what our mission is, and we do dedicate some effort to that. And actually being able to do that and actually not have, for example, plaintiff attorney lawsuits would actually, I think, be a good thing.
And what do you do at LinkedIn that's specifically dedicated saying we're doing for the public good rather than just for the good of our shareholders?
Well, so, I mean, we have a LinkedIn for Good program. The LinkedIn for Good program has various initiatives. So, for example, one of the things we put in to the LinkedIn profile, because part of what we experiment with is how a network can be a platform. We said, well, because there's a long backlog of features that we want to put into profiles that have very direct commercial application, but we actually put in a feature of what are you interested in volunteering for? What are your nonprofit causes? And as such, we've actually gotten over 10 million people to fill that out. So you have actually a basis by which people can either find each other or nonprofits can find people and say, okay, here are folks who are dedicated enough to essentially civic or nonprofit engagement that they fill out a profile in order to be searchable and findable on that basis. Those are of the kinds of things we do.
You do it for veterans.
And we do jobs for veterans. We have a whole program by which we get veterans essentially free job seeker subscriptions, so that helping them essentially find getting back to work. We have a lot more to do on this, but how do you essentially map your veteran experience into a job search? There's things that we do for nonprofits in terms of finding board members. And then, like I mentioned, we're beginning to scope out a mentorship program.
I know you're relatively close to President Obama in the White House, and you've been there for dinner. Have you discussed these things with the White House? And what does President Obama push you to do?
Well, I think President Obama is very dedicated to how do we increase the nature of civic engagement so that we are much better off as a society. And those are generally the conversations I have. It's not so much pushing LinkedIn per se, but actually, in fact, how do we actually, in fact, come together to actually have the right outcomes for the country? And I think his, not to speak for him, but I think his greatest hope is that more of kind of everyday Americans would feel an ownership of the civic political process. And that would actually go a long way to improving the sorts of, obviously, political problems that we're seeing in gridlock and other problems.
Oh, Ev Williams and I were talking earlier about the internet sort of going astray in a way, making us more divisive. I mean, this is not to put words in Ev's mouth, but we're talking about
to do that usually.
Yeah, problems that the internet has lived up to much of its potential, but not all. What do you think, if you could help redesign social networks and the internet, what would you do?
Well, I have been helping, but so let's see. I think that one of the key challenges that I think, and Ev is taking this shot on directly, and I a little bit more indirectly at the moment, but how do we essentially raise the level of public discourse, right? How do we have more people with kind of thoughtful positions, a little bit like, our honoree in terms of like, okay, what is a reasonable position here? How do we understand it? Now, obviously, the internet, when it's anonymous, most people here probably understand it has a lot of trolls, has an adverse selection in terms of a bunch of hate speech. It's recently been in the news a lot for kind of how the Reddit community tends to behave, the extremities of the Reddit, a lot of the Reddit community people are just fine, but the extremities of it is fairly grotesque. And And so the kinds of things you do is you have real name identity, you have discourse that allows you to actually make a reason case, and then actually, in fact, be able to promote that and share that in the right way. And that's, of course, what Ev is trying to do with Medium, at least in part. I think it's one of the things that we need to get to, that part of the promise of the internet is to actually try to get a more discursive and enlightened society, as opposed to a fragmented society where people are listening to each other's, unbacked up pronouncements, and including on the anonymous base. This is one of the reasons I'm never a fan of, and I've passed on all of the anonymous sites as an investment, is actually to own your discourse and to be reasonable citizens doing it.
When the internet first got underway, or even before it got underway, there were things like The Well, which were discussion platforms in which Stuart Brand and others said, you own your own words. And nobody could be truly anonymous. When the internet protocols came, you could be anonymous. Sometimes people talk about, even Jeff Rosen talks about, privacy. But I think sometimes that they confuse privacy with anonymity. Would we be better off if we had an internet with less anonymity?
I think we would, although that's usually a question of how good the governance is. So, for example, if you need anonymity to overthrow a very bad government, then those are usually the arguments for anonymity. Anything else, I think, is actually, in fact, when you have a democracy, you have a civic discourse, you are much better off by people saying, here's what I think, and I own the position of where I am. And by the way, you have some risks with that too. I mean, the classic, rule of the masses, and you have some political correctness and some other issues, which are legitimate problems, but I don't think those are solved by anonymity. I think those are best solved by learning to express yourself and, kind of building up to your argument in the right ways and so forth.
Is there a way to re-engineer the internet in the days of bullying, cyberbullying, anonymity, and hacking to make it so that either the internet or some network that ran parallel to the internet would have verified identity and people taking responsibility for everything they did?
It's definitely possible to re-engineer. How really doable it is. I mean, for example, you said if everyone adopted certain kinds of protocols, if you had a certain kind of way that you did identity. I mean, for example, the cybersecurity would be a lot better, right? If essentially every server was actually, in fact, signed and you knew where that server traffic was coming from.
And you had packets that not only had address headers, but origin.
Yes, exactly. So generally speaking, I think that's much better, and that's doable, but whether or not it's doable in a retrofit way that would cause enough people to buy into it. Because essentially to do it, you effectively have to essentially fork the internet in a certain way and then have everyone adopt that fork. And that is actually, in fact, a non-trivial, it's doable in a land of possibility, but it's a very difficult program to implement.
And what about LinkedIn? Is there a way to use LinkedIn as a platform in which I can trust the people I'm talking to?
Easily. So, for example, part of the thing that a network of identities is like, okay, who do we know in common? Can I ask them about you? Is their identity, there's a lot still to do to get higher levels of trust and identity on LinkedIn. But you can see, for example, not only are they situated in a network relative to you, but are people that you recognize, have they given them endorsements? There's a variety of ways to essentially kind of cross-check what someone's identity is.
So you could have credentialing and cross-checking by that. What role could the blockchain play in that?
So the blockchain is, I think, a extremely good internet-like platform for financial applications. And so if you think about it, about what money fundamentally is it's a ledger. And as a ledger that you now have as a distributed source that essentially anyone can build applications on the same way that people can build applications on the internet, is, I think, actually, in fact, the thing that's most interesting about Bitcoin. Now, in terms of identity, it's a little trickier for the following reason, which is you can sign something with a cryptographic key that's associated with the blockchain that says, okay, this statement or this transaction is signed with this cryptographic key. However, you still have the challenge of, is that cryptographic key Walter? right? Like, was that, or was it just your phone, and Reid got a hold of your phone, and was using your phone to do that?
But can't you fix that for me?
Not perfectly.
And to what extent do you see Bitcoin playing a role, or should there be some, I mean, is Bitcoin a little bit too weird for the average person paying at Starbucks, and we need a digital currency that's verified?
So I think Bitcoin, so I wrote a piece in Wired UK in May where I said that there will be a global cryptocurrency. I called it crypto capital, actually, and it will either be Bitcoin or one of its derivatives. So I do think we need one. I think we need one primarily for it as a platform. Because one of the things that a lot of Bitcoin adherents say is, oh, it'll be one currency, it'll be Bitcoin. No, just like we have multiple currencies today. We have euros, we have dollars, we have...
Drachma.
Yeah, get drachma, the new script. Yes, I agree with that one. And so, inasmuch as we have multiple currencies, I actually think having a cryptocurrency as an additional currency is actually very handy in a number of different ways. Not just because you can build software applications, but because it enables cross-border commerce. It enables emerging market countries that can't afford, because banking systems are actually very expensive. You can do lightweight electronic banking. That's actually very helpful. So I think there's a number of things that it is actually very good for. I don't think you need Bitcoin in order to pay Starbucks in the US.
What about for micropayments?
So most people misunderstand micropayments. The real challenge with micropayments is not so much that, like for example, the card systems are expensive enough that usually a transaction is under $1 is prohibitively expensive to do, especially if it's a non-digital good. But the actual real issue with micropayments is all the things that go around it. So for example, what happens if it goes wrong? What happens if it's fraud? What happens if I didn't get my thing, give it back to me? The customer service cost on all of this is actually very, very high. So there's a number of problems to solve with micropayments that are not simply the credit card transaction fees. Now, maybe Bitcoin could be made to do those, or another thing could be made to do those, but it's not simply a get the fee structure down to what is nearly free in a Bitcoin transfer.
But couldn't it be transformative for the digital content creation world to have easy payment systems that allow people to buy digital content? Songs, words, whatever.
In theory, yes. I would say that the theory has the following worry, which is one of the reasons why an advertising ecosystem is built up around a lot of content. Because if you say, well, what this item of content's really, call it 3 cents, 2 cents, a nickel, but I have to make the transaction decision. The transaction decision causes a great drop-off in consumer behavior.
But if I drive across the Delaware Bridge with my Easy Pass, I don't make a transaction decision. It's automatically deducted. Couldn't we have something like that that says, there's a great piece that Kate Lee has put on Medium, I want it, it's 12 cents, I'm not going to have a transaction cost?
So people have tried to do that in various startups. There are still startups trying to do that. I would be delighted for those to be successful. I would say that the hesitancy is that part of the reason why an advertising system evolved is because actually, in fact, people would prefer to say, well, I just don't have to think about it. I don't have to be monitoring an account. I don't have to think about how much is deducted from it. They prefer all you can eat as mechanisms. And so most of the mechanisms that do this, things like Vessel and other ones are saying, look, it's an all you can eat subscription. Once you have it, you don't have to worry about like it's 2 cents here, 5 cents here, 8 cents there. You just get a wide variety of content. I think those are more likely to be successful. I think some of those will work. But those aren't really microtransactions, although there may be micro payments in terms of how the subscription fee is divided amongst the content creators.
But isn't there something odious and morally abhorrent by having most content supported by advertising? This isn't a loaded question.
Not at all. Well, look, I guess on this vector, I tend to be a little bit more of a free market person. So I do think that, look, I get irritated by advertising. I do think there's a bias selection advertising. But I think that, for example, people can vote with, well, I'm either, like, for example, I will normally buy, like if there's an option to buy content and have no advertising, I will do that. I'm
not talking about the problem of a consumer having to look at an ad. I'm talking about the fact that if you're creating content to get aggregate eyeballs for advertisers, you're going to do crappy clickbait and do, baby diapers. You're not going to cover Baghdad.
Well, I think that actually you'll always be driven by your commercial incentive. So the question is, what is the commercial incentive? If you're getting a nickel per view, you may also be doing clickbait.
Yeah, but if you're more beholden to your readers and your advertisers, you may at least be more intellectually honest.
Well, I don't know if. I think both will have commercial systems. I'd be completely delighted if it's a. And by the way, for a contrast, China's internet has no advertising system, and so all of it's done by payment.
Well, I guess that's a way to put down my proposal, since I'm
That-
not sure
that-
we want to go that route. What could
I was just pointing it out.
I know it was very clever of you, and I now feel put down. What could LinkedIn do? I mean, what is the next phase for LinkedIn in addressing any of the problems we've just discussed?
Well, so look, I think that LinkedIn's primary thing is actually how do you help every individual work better from what they do, a problem they're trying to solve, to what they're doing with their career. How do you have the right kind of business intelligence to do that? And how do you make the right connections? And then from individuals up to organizations, nations, et cetera. That's what LinkedIn's focus is. And so, when we tackle this version of the problem, what we are trying to solve is how to essentially, when an individual is trying to say, okay, what information should I base my actions on? Whether it's taking a job, whether it's solving a particular task in a job, whether it's making a deal, whether it's which skills should I learn, those are the kinds of things that we are trying to solve. Because if we make individuals much better at that, we make their economic potential much better, both for themselves and for their families and for the companies and everything else. So that's how we do that. So we're not as focused on, for example, the details of how do you fix a political discourse, right? Obviously, if it ends up being positive there, that's great. But that's actually not the central focus. I actually think that one of the things that happens in the internet is you get such a profusion of content that one of the things I think we will be seeing overlays of in the next decade is how do you have information reputation systems so you know in this massive sea of content what kinds of things to know and trust. And some of that will be brand proxies, like, oh, if it's source X, this person, this site. But some of it I think will also be a notion of kind of how, for example, networks of people you trust vote on things that you go, oh, this is actually, in fact, I should trust this is true.
So reputational networks will help us make our search as well as other decisions.
Yes.
And does that mean that there'll be some way to supplant Google as a pure search engine someday? I mean, could LinkedIn or others say, here's a better way to know what you want?
Well, I think there's been some thinking about that. I mean, there was some discussion of that a couple years back when Facebook launched its search engine. I do think that the notion of how do you create better information trust systems, there's still a long ways to go, and that Google's current system is not the final word. Whether it'll be Google evolving it or new systems building it, I think is still TBD.
Let me ask a really dumb question I should know. Does Google search all my LinkedIn contacts and pages?
No, it doesn't search all of yours. We do have a setting that's the default that you publish a light version of your profile to Google because we presume that the default behavior is when someone's searching for you by name, they might want to, you might want them to find your LinkedIn page.
So will there be different search engines that try to capture apps and social networks, mobile?
Well, I think there are. I mean, like LinkedIn does a much richer kind of search engine for a variety of functions on top of LinkedIn itself. Facebook also has a graph search for saying, such questions as, people probably haven't done this, which of my friends like country and Western music, right? You can actually do that kind of search on Facebook. And so those search engines already exist. Now, the earlier question you're asking is when you begin to get to, like, okay, do I trust this document or this particular piece of content? Or I'm looking for the best piece of content on, say, what do I think is happening with Greece right now? What's the search engine that gives me that, right? And currently, that's Google, right? But that could evolve in the future.
And are you pursuing that?
LinkedIn, no, not yet.
And who do you think might pursue that? And
well, so I think any of the, because again, networks as platforms, I think any of the network, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, any of the networks as platforms, I think, could pursue it if they wanted to. I don't think that, I'm not an insider at either Twitter and Facebook, so I don't know what they're actually doing or not, but I imagine they're not, because I think there's other challenges that they're solving. From a LinkedIn perspective, it kind of is, as opposed to kind of like any particular web page, it's how do you actually find the right information that professionals need to find in order to be more effective, either day by day or in their careers.
And are you keeping directly focused on how do I help professionals be better in their careers, which is what you just said, or are you expanding the focus of what LinkedIn will be 5 years from now?
Well, so we think of how do we help professionals get connected to the right opportunities, the right resources, which includes information, and anything from a particular problem they're trying to solve to like what are the judgments they're making over years and decades in their career. And so, for example, one of the things that most people don't use LinkedIn for, but they can today, is if you were, for example, trying to solve the problem of, all right, how do I get better civic engagement and how do I have information trust systems? Actually, part of what I do is I go and start searching LinkedIn amongst my first and second degree contacts to see who I should talk to about that. Because our brains aren't computers, and you can find, actually, in fact, you'll remember a few of the people who are good, but you will probably find people who are better than the people you remembered, because our brains aren't computers.
Before I open it up, which I'm about to do right now, my last question is, you're a Crown Fellow. To what extent did being a Crown Fellow help you think through the social impact and the social responsibility of the type of enterprise you're creating?
So I had already created everything on LinkedIn years before I became a Crown Fellow. I did a master's degree in philosophy at Oxford. So another.
What was your specialty?
Philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and Wittgenstein. Right, were the three.
Searle and Wittgenstein.
Yeah. So more Wittgenstein than Searle, although Searle's
early or late.
Yes, late. Although I'm actually, sorry, this is very wonkish. I'm actually one of those.
Everybody at Aspen Institute knows the difference between early Wittgenstein and late Wittgenstein.
I don't think you can understand late Wittgenstein without a thorough understanding of early Wittgenstein. Like, I think he himself wanted to publish philosophical investigations and the Tractatus together. Right, so anyway, wonkish.
Did he understand early Wittgenstein?
Not as well as some, I think, but reasonably. Sorry, what question were we on?
We were on the question of social impact.
Got
you
it,
were
yes.
an Aspen Crown Fellow.
Yes, sorry.
You're now giving all the credit to Oxford University. I'm trying to get you to give some credit to the Aspen Institute.
So I would say that the primary thing that I learned from the Crown Fellowship was that actually, in fact, leadership institutes are extremely useful in helping shape society. And so part of the reason why Michelle and I became donors for the Pahara Fellowship was precisely because of the Crown Fellowship, as here are things that actually, in fact, shaping a group of leaders who help form a network is
the
actually...
The Pahara Fellowship is our Crown program for people in the K through 12 education
yes, exactly.
space.
So that is, I think, what I would say is, it's not as much LinkedIn. LinkedIn was already on its trajectory, but getting involved with Pahara wouldn't have happened without Crown.
Let me open it up. Questions. Evan. I know. There's a microphone behind you.
It's coming to you.
Evan Williams, who created, everybody knows he created Twitter and also Medium, which is something Kate Lee was here publishing for IdeaSets, but also created Blogger, which really got us into this age. So, Evan.
It's true. Thanks for the plug. And thanks for putting me on the spot. He did warn me he was going to put me on the spot, but I'm still nonetheless on the spot. I wanted to go back to the anonymity question, because it's not as clear to me. I think there's a default reaction a lot of people have when they see a lot of crap on the internet to say, well, if people own their words, that would be better. But first of all, I believe in China, speaking of, to post to the internet, you can't be anonymous for a very specific reason. But I don't think it's just if you have bad governments that's a problem, because isn't it the case that any oppressed part of civilization, if they don't have the opportunity to speak freely and not necessarily be known, by people who may penalize them for speaking freely seems like an incredibly powerful benefit that the internet has brought into society that didn't exist before. How would you think about that?
Well, so I think it's a trade-off of look, it's not a pure decision. I think it's a trade-off of evils. So if you're in a place where you say, look, there's actually, in fact, a great deal of general oppression happening, people that independent, rational, third-party group of people would say, oh, those people are being oppressed, they need these tools to be free, that's useful. Now, if that happens to be folks who are saying, actually, in fact, what we should do is we should create biological weapons and wipe out a certain race or that kind of stuff, I'm not so much interested in defending their anonymity. So it's a trade-off between the two that comes down. That I was using a government as a proxy for it, is how well organized is society in terms of human rights, liberties, etc. If it is reasonably, where there is a, and by the way, without anonymity, there's always even just social pressure and peer pressure and a bunch of other things. So there are pressures that are not great that happen with a pure lack of anonymity. But on the other hand, the question is how does that badness weigh against the other badness? And I think it's roughly speaking, how well are you organized? And that was the reason I used that as an early answer. And so I tend to come down because, for example, I've basically looked at a number of different social networks to invest in, and I passed on all of the ones that were anonymous because I think they're the wrong kind of platform for what you want to do. So Secret, right? I passed on Whisper, right? I passed on because these things were effectively like, no, this doesn't create the right kind of dialogue. It doesn't create the right kind of community. Like I agree that there's a bunch of interesting stuff that happens on Reddit, but the interesting stuff for me is very difficult relative to the really terrible stuff that happens. Like I think the terrible stuff that happens, the sexist comments, the death threats, it's like, okay, that's a serious issue, right? And so therefore it's a kind of a balance of, you're not gonna get to 100% good, but which bads do you take?
When you passed on something like Secret, Whisper, and you're not fond of Reddit, did you do it for economic reasons, or did you do it because you wouldn't be doing a civic good by investing in them?
I have the benefit of having enough good investments that I can also apply a moral
Civic
principle.
good filter.
Yes, and so I actually apply that filter. So I didn't get to evaluating it as an economic investment.
And Ev, when you created Twitter, it was different from Facebook because Facebook tried to make you non-anonymous. Twitter allowed you to be. Was that a conscious decision? And did you make that same decision when you created Medium? I can't remember because I'm on Medium, but I'm on with my real name. Does Medium promote anonymity?
Yeah, all the systems that I've built, it sort of. Yeah. With those systems, they take basically the default of the internet, which is anonymity is not assumed, unlike Secret and Whisper, where everyone's anonymous. But you can be pseudonymous, so there's no guarantee that people are who they say they are. We then created the verified badge on Twitter that was later copied on other systems because people were being impersonated, and so we wanted to build more trust into the system. But we wouldn't go, as far as I'm concerned, based on the principles we feel important in Twitter and Medium, we wouldn't go to a completely named, verified account system, even if that was an easy thing to do, because there are too many people who use it pseudonymously for, we think, important reasons. Of course, a lot of that is international and in places where people do not have freedom of speech as a right. But the other thing I would say is there's other ways. What I think is critically important to raise the quality of dialogue is to not necessarily know exactly who people are, but it's to have systems that don't necessarily give everyone the same seat at the table unless they've earned it. And there has to be some consequences if you abuse the seat that you've earned. So I like having dinner parties, but I don't leave my front door open in San Francisco to let anyone come by and sit at the dinner party. But the internet, that was our assumption from day one, that if you're on the internet, then we want to talk to you. But now that everyone's on the internet, that's not necessarily the case. But there's much more facility for meeting the person who you would never imagine you want to talk to, who does have worthwhile things to say, to earn their place. And that's what we're trying to do with Medium, is say anyone can publish anything. It's not necessarily going to be seen. That's a little bit of work, and maybe you have to promote yourself or whatever. But once you earn that, then you have much more chance to influence other people than you would in other ways.
Further questions or thoughts? In the way back, causing our microphone runners to truly run.
And by the way, I mostly agree that it's not 100% 0%. Like if I were to choose, I would choose 80% identity and 20% anonymity, roughly, and then the implications.
And could you ID yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Matt Schifrin, I'm first time Socrates here. Big fan, obviously. Good work.
Thank you.
Yeah. A couple of the panels here are talking about technology in the 21st century and how that's impacting everything from life, culture, work, all these good things. There's a common theme that keeps coming up on both of the panels, which is privacy. And this is obviously a hot topic for whether it's you or Evan or other people in this room. And I'm just kind of curious about your perception of today's privacy rules and really where you see us going in the future, and if you have a particular opinion of which direction that should go.
So I think that one of the challenges with general privacy discussion is that the line of what people think is right is a movable line. So for example, if pre-Facebook you said, I'm going to create a system that allows people you don't know to upload photos of you, where other people you don't know can tag you in them, and then people you do know will see them possibly before you do, what do you think of that photo sharing system, right? And you would say, oh my God, terrible, right? 1.3 billion people every day, right? And they have added to the system and modified it. They say, okay, well, we have a very active takedown system when we get a complaint. We allow people to untag themselves, a whole bunch of things. And then people go, actually, in fact, I stay connected in a way that's actually pretty useful to me. So the general challenge that I have on the privacy debate is that you say, well, what we should do is enshrine our current view of privacy against future innovation is in fact actually not the right target. The right target is to say we should stay very reactive about what kind of future we're creating, which does include privacy, and you have to balance out security and a bunch of other things, but we should make sure that we do that in the right way. And so that's actually a discuss as we go versus a prescribe a very narrow channel in the future. And so I tend to be the let's be very transparent. Let's have people say what they're doing and then stay close to it, and then modify as we begin to discover these things work, these things don't work as a process.
Yeah, right there.
Hi, I'm Noah Lichtenstein. I'm a partner at Cowboy Ventures, early stage venture fund. Huge fan of LinkedIn, but a question I had for you is, well, I'm a first-time Socrates program member, and one of the topics here that I'm part of is the future of work. And as part of that discussion, as we think about the gig-based economy and shift-based workers, as the creator of LinkedIn, how do you think about, whether from LinkedIn or your own personal perspective, how do you think about this new type of workforce and how you create the system of whether it's endorsements or skills-based or project-based work? How does a whole new class of workers get represented in the same way that the traditional workers have been represented in LinkedIn?
So one of my partners at Greylock, Simon Hoffman, wrote a piece on the uncollared workforce, which is trying to essentially say what kind of the third workforce is and kind of things that will need to happen and evolve. So, for example, one thing I think it will be important is that gig-based workers are not, for example, locked into any particular platform, that they can bring some of their reputation and their success with them so that they have essentially some labor mobility, right, which is, I think, an important part of a healthy society. I think there will be other kinds of innovations as we think about what is the right thing to have a healthy society and a functioning economy that works for the individuals and for the network. But I think actually there's a bunch of really active work that needs to happen here. But for a short answer, Simon Rothman's post is actually a good, first page.
Jennifer, did you want to talk about the potential of using it for international ways to create networks? Because we were talking about that at dinner.
Lesson, be careful about talking to Walter before, before a panel.
Jennifer has been at the State Department and now runs a Stevens Initiative, which is creating virtual exchanges.
So I guess I would just say it's fantastic to be at this table number 3. Clearly we're all on the spot. Didn't realize that before I sat down. I think as I'm listening, I have a million thoughts in my head. As one of the millions of former government officials whose information is now in the hands of the Chinese, I'm sure there's many in this room tonight, I have thoughts about privacy, but talking to Walter's question, I think there is an amazing capacity for the digital platforms and the technology as it stands today to be a driver of engagement between cultures and across borders, particularly amongst youth who are interconnected already. And I guess my question, I'm going to switch this, is how, Reid, do you see that the advancements in technology could drive good? How can we capture this technology for good rather than non-good?
Well, so I think by default, otherwise I wouldn't be in the industry I am. I think we are on balance doing very good things. I think that connectivity, ability to hear voices, like for example, during the Iraq War, the fact that we could pay attention to bloggers, from the other side, that was actually, in fact, I think something is beginning and unique as an instance, and I think that's stuff that we are seeing already. I think that the key thing gets to how do we essentially make sure that was part of the reason why, to Walter's earlier question, is if the more that we have, we know what is true and what is truth, and that forms a consensus of a kind of shared knowledge, where that then should allow us to be in a much better place, right? So, for example, I would hope that the general availability of the mass of social media is, and I don't know this because I'm not a researcher, but I would hope it's doing great things for example, gender rights around the world, right? I would hope that, because the fact is, unless you're isolating your society entirely from the internet, there's a bunch of role models, examples, information, that in some societies, those kinds of basic human rights don't exist there, right? And so that would be the kind of thing that I'm hopeful for is already happening. How we amplify it is we try to make sure that the mechanisms for which information is actually true to inform citizenry then allows the right kinds of pressure on governments, the right kind of governments to act the right way in terms of policies and other sorts of things. And so now, that being said, we don't have a perfect information. The disinformation is possible. There's obviously negative things like the way that in the Middle East, videos being used for recruitment and other kinds of things, which is a challenge. So it's not this is very broad brush. It's not utopian. But I think that by having more of a open dialogue and a dialogue over things that you learn to be true or come to understand and trust to be true, I think makes progress. And that's a very broad brush answer, but then you get into specifics of how do you create networks, how do you essentially help people collaborate together for a better future. Anyway,
Gary. And then is there somebody back there? I can't.
So it seems like it's the natural order of events that as the high integrity founders like yourself distance yourself from the original company, that the company tends to do things that compromise user happiness over time for their commercial satisfaction. Do spammy kind of things, asking you to endorse people for this and that, and you can't turn it off through privacy settings and so forth. So the question is, are there ways that you can put in safeguards to try to hold the organizations more highly accountable to the things that'll satisfy long-term growth instead of next quarter's growth?
So we are, I'm not distanced from LinkedIn, so I own the errors that irritate anyone in this room. I own it in part. So just to be clear, I'm not distancing myself from the errors. Unfortunately, when endorsements was launched, which is like a 0.2 feature, we didn't get to 0.3 very fast. That was my primary irritation. I own some of that failure, because there are ways to make it, it is usable now, but it's very noisy, and there's ways to make it much more usable. I thought there was a way to turning it off, and I will go check that. So I will cross-check that assertion of yours, and maybe I'm wrong. Right? I will be very irritated if there isn't, right? And embarrassed. So I think that the key question about, I think that one of the macro things that I am very nervous about in terms of the way that public company governance leads to is safe short-term decisions. And so how do you essentially fix that so that you go to long-term decisions in ways that are different than, dual class share is something I think is actually extremely important to do. I don't think anyone has a good answer to that problem right now. I'm not even sure how many people are working on it, but I think it's actually very important. Because the erosion that happens isn't just kind of like, oh, do you stand up to analysts? But what happens is, for example, your entire company is listening to the news around it. And if all the analysts are going, oh, these people are making terribly stupid decisions because they're not essentially making decisions that intensely maximize this quarter's numbers, you actually can have a challenge with that. So there is a structural governance problem that actually needs to be solved. Now, some part of it, and I haven't developed this thinking a lot, but I do think that one of the things that's actually really important is to actually figure out, not just when you're hiring CEOs and executives, but how to essentially be hiring co-founders. And how do you have people who pick up the mission as deeply? They're not just, oh, I'm a professional manager, what I care about is the P&L, but actually, in fact, this mission, that's actually part of what my identity is, and I'm here to actually elaborate that. And to have that be part of what is executive succession. And I think that also in part leads to that, because I know that from Jeff Weiner, who actually operates in this way perfectly.
Last question, the woman in the back.
I'm so glad you brought up gender rights earlier, because the tech industry has come under a lot of fire for that exact issue. As both an organization in the tech industry and a professional platform, how are you addressing this issue?
So let's see. So I think that so Silicon Valley has a bunch of different challenges, and so let's see. As a venture firm, we made a decision, a couple years ago that we weren't going to hire another partner until we hired a female partner. We did that. We're not stopping with one, right? We're still working on that because you have to walk the walk yourself. Greylock's a 50-year-old firm, and it was like, it's way past due, right? And so we put 2 years of effort into that. And we run a variety of programs, for example, on, career mentoring and other kinds of things in order to facilitate that. There's something that I can't pre-announce, but will be announced at Fortune Brainstorm here in a couple of days, that also bears on gender in the Valley and kind of senior participation that we're part of and are helping as Greylock. And then as LinkedIn, we put a fair amount of energy into thinking about how do we make various parts of our service help amplify that, whether it's anything from do we have, like for example, we're going to make sure that classes on kind of bias correction and so forth are available on Lynda and are freely available, to everyone. That kind of thing is the kinds of things that we're talking about. That probably counts as some vague pre-announcement, but since it doesn't hit anything with earnings, it shouldn't be a problem, right? And we don't have a specific timeline for it either yet, but that's the kind of thing we look at. We also try to make sure, and we very much appreciate any kind of feedback that says, do we have any gender bias and how we're evolving the product and how should we change it? Because we try to make it inclusive as much as we can. For example, one of the things that we made a decision very early on is we don't ask gender because we don't think that there's any particular utility. It'd be very helpful for our advertising business, for example, to have that, but we didn't think there was any particular utility in doing that, and that part of the way that you maintain trust with people is that you only ever ask for information that they have a clear sense of what it is that you're doing with that. And so, anyway, those are some beginnings, but I'll just say one thing. There's a frequent meme within Silicon Valley that says Silicon Valley is a meritocracy, and it's clearly wrong on a number of different vectors. Gender is one of them. Actually, in fact, the absolute worst one is if you consider the Hispanic population within California, and you go to the tech industry, both within venture and within the companies, we have a long way to go. And that clearly disproves the theory that we are a pure meritocracy. Some of it legitimately is get more people into CS, get more people in engineering. There are some real issues there too, but help the nonprofits that are doing that, help the universities that are doing that, and actually the Stanford CS program is, I think, 50-50 on gender now.
Reid Hoffman, founder of LinkedIn, Crown Fellow of the Aspen Institute, and an absolutely fascinating after-dinner speaker. Thank you so much, Reid.